I'm making this video here to respond to my buddy Cubism. I discovered his channel recently. I don't know if he started posting recently or if I just discovered it recently, but he covers he has a few different varieties of topics that he touches on, but one of them is are his ontological views. So ontology is sort of the study of the things that exist, and especially the relationship of things like the physical to the mental. And so some of the popular views out there that you'll see are idealism, the view that everything is mental; physicalism, the view that everything is physical; panpsychism, the idea that all physical things have a sort of mentality to them. Um, Cubism has his own version of what's called phenomenalism that I'll be talking about in this video. There are dualists, people who believe that the physical and mental are separate substances, and I myself I don't have strong metaphysical commitments. I find a lot of them to be plausible, but I find most attractive views that are called neutral monists, that basically say that there's no fundamental divide between mental and physical phenomena. There are sort of different perspectives of the same underlying reality, and so, in my own view, it'll leanings, I should say. It's not something I have strong commitments to, but I'll talk a bit about that as we go through, as much to offer an alternative as to try to convince anybody of any particular view. But I think there's a lot of commonality between neutral monist views and phenomenalist views. So there's a lot of points that we agree on. In this video, my purpose is mostly just to lay out my understanding of his ontological views, and I will inject some of my own thoughts in areas where there's potential disagreements, but I'm not going to go too far into those in this video. My plan is to follow up with another video that goes a little bit more into the details on where we might specifically disagree and try to cash out some of those things. But in any case, he's a super interesting, sharp guy. He has really original ideas that he presents in a really direct way, but still there's something to be grasped there. And he presents his ideas with a lot of humility, and definitely worth checking out, and you should absolutely watch some of his videos. So we'll get into it here. So the first thing is his name, onto Cubism. I think it has some. He's very interesting thinker and a creative guy, and he has a very interesting aesthetic. But his idea, as you'll see as we go through this, is that the different faces of, are what he calls them, which is basically different perspectives of things in the world, are the conjunction of those is what makes up the underlying reality. And so, it's sort of as a cubist painting, like you get you can see the same object from multiple perspectives within the same painting. And I think he has a video where he talks about that being some of the inspiration for his name. So the text that I'm going to be showing, almost all of it throughout this video, is excerpted from exchanges that we've had. So pretty much everything you'll see and I'll read is going to be quoted from him. So the first quote that I have here is, he says, "A phenomenal field is a face of the world. The world is only a system of these faces. We don't know how many of these faces there are. Most of us will perhaps agree that these faces will come and go as their mortal sights come and go." Okay, so he's starting off by calling these things faces, and basically he's saying that they're phenomenal fields. Phenomenal meaning sort of experiential, and we'll see more as we go forward. So I'm going to have a rough outline of what the main points are. And so the first is that the world is a set of phenomenal fields, which he calls faces. He says, I'd call a conscious entity a site of or for the world streaming. My own empirical ego, which people tend to regard as conscious, is present in the world, manifesting within a plurality of such streamings. So I'm going to pause here because I think it's important to note he's saying a plurality of such streamings, meaning that your own empirical ego, what he calls your empirical ego, is not only something that you experience yourself, but it's also distributed amongst the experience of other people. And so your own being is in some way distributed amongst these other faces. So the site of a particular streaming, meaning your streaming, only contains part of your empirical ego, which is distributed amongst your friends and the people that you interact with, etc. Continuing with his quote, "The site is indeed a thing of this world. My own empirical ego is present within the phenomenal stream or face of the world that is associated with it." I have sometimes called this face an ontological ego. So what he's doing here, in my understanding, is he's distinguishing the ontological ego from what he was talking about previously, the empirical ego. So he says the ontological ego is something that sort of arises within a particular phenomenal stream or face of the world. So within one of these phenomenal streams, there's something that we call a self or an ego. And that self or ego is not a sort of fundamental feature of the phenomenal stream, but is instead sort of, it arises within the stream. And so he says first in this quote that a conscious entity is a phenomenal stream, which he calls a face. So these things are all sort of pretty close to synonymous in my understanding. Ego is present within the stream, but is not the stream. So whatever your self is, it's something that sort of manifests within this stream, but it's sort of a concept that we apply onto the stream, but it's not the stream itself necessarily. It's not a strict identity. If the world is identified with qualitative presencing of all of its infinity of faces, he says, then entities in the world have all of their being in such faces. So this qualitative presencing is something that is sort of a recurring theme, and I have a lot of affinity for this idea that all existence is in some way qualitative. Qualitative meaning something that's not just amenable to abstract description. It's something that there's something ineffable about it. So some of these things would be things like qualia, like the classic smell of coffee, things like that. But I think it's a little bit deeper. I think that there's sort of a sense of existence itself, which is not able to be captured in language or equations or things like this. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. So the first is that these abstract representations, whether it's math or language, they're designed in order to be divorced from the existence or the ontology of something. The purpose of an abstraction is to indicate an entity or a potential set of entities without actually being that set of entities. And so I think part of it is just sort of a flat, the abstraction by its nature is not the thing itself. And I think anything that is sort of ineffable, unexpressible, or not able to be captured within an abstraction or, via the specification of some kind of a structure or something like that is sort of, by definition, qualitative. And so I think there's some tie-ins even here between, many people would have heard the famous quote, I think, from Hawking, what breathes fire into the equation. So you have these equations, but the equation is not the reality. There's something deeper, even if you feel like you've captured something very deep with the equation, it isn't the reality itself. So I have a lot of affinity for that. Now the second part, he says, then the entity, if the world is identified with the qualitative presencing of its potential infinity of faces, then entities in the world have all of their being in such faces. So one thing here is that he talks in the first part and in terms of a potential infinity of faces. And I know that in our discussions I've had a little bit of confusion about this because in my view the view that I find most attractive, I'm just going to call it my view, it's not something I'm like completely committed to, but the view that I sort of, a sketch that I find attractive is one where basically the entire world is one single sort of field of existence, and that field of existence is made up of qualitative things. The relations between those qualitative things are what determine the structure and are the things that you can describe with equations and abstractions. But the things themselves are qualitative and ineffable, and in some sense you sort of have to be that thing in order to really grasp what it is in its existence. So I have a lot of affinity for all existence being qualitative, but I have a little bit of a broader view of this qualitative field where I don't know if it makes sense to say that all of them are within a conscious entity or within a phenomenal stream, because I have the intuition that a lot of sort of simple, what we'd call inanimate objects have a kind of uninteresting, maybe incoherent sort of qualitative aspect. Like this is just a picture. I don't think that this is actually what it's like. But like, you can imagine just sort of like a radio or TV static of sort of unstructured qualitative things. And just to give a little bit more of a picture of this, like I kind of picture the quality as being the stuff and the structure arises from it. So I kind of give the example of a canvas. If you have a blank canvas with no colors on it, there's no structure. But as soon as you put the qualities on there, the colors, then structure can emerge from that. And okay, so back to his point here. I think you might be able to. Well, I think you could argue with this point in terms of identifying it with the faces if you don't accept that all qualities have to be within a face. So I'm just going to say that part. But going back to our list here, so the fourth point that we have is that all being is qualitative presencing, and I think that there's I share that sort of intuition with him, and then that entities of the world have. He says that entities of the world have all of their being within phenomenal streams, which in the picture that I have, I think you'd have to contort my picture a little bit in order to agree with this statement here. He says, I don't think the fire hydrant in front of my house is conscious, but I think that it has all of its being in the faces of the world, associated with other such beings that are regarded as conscious. So this is very important here because he says pretty clearly what a portion of what I think ultimately I will have some disagreements with, which is that essentially the fire hydrant doesn't have any being in and of itself. It's sort of splintered, and I think he's used the word splintered in some videos, or shattered. It's sort of separated, and you take different parts of it, and all of its being is just separated out amongst the conscious beings. So the essential picture of this is that, I mean, it sort of has some very counterintuitive properties, and he calls his ideas sort of psychedelic, which I think the ideas that he has are very intriguing and sort of beautiful in a certain way, and even I guess intriguing, beautiful, and interesting to consider, regardless of whether we end up agreeing with it or not. But basically, you have this idea where a couple of the results of this is that if you have a new observer of this fire hydrant, essentially new parts of that fire hydrant just pop into existence, apparently, because the new experience of this fire hydrant from this new perspective wasn't there before, and now it is. And so I think he would say that there are some in some way new parts of this fire hydrant that are popping into existence, but there is no fire hydrant that's independent of these entities that are looking at it. And I think intuitively, we a lot of people would have some difficulty grasping that, and I think that's ultimately where I think there's going to be some problems, at least as far as I see it, in terms of fully agreeing with him. Even though I have a lot of affinity for a lot of his ideas, and I think that they're all interesting nonetheless. So the last thing here is that not all things are or have faces, and that those that aren't are splintered among those with the faces. So the inanimate objects or the non-conscious objects are separated amongst those that are. So just a recap here. So he's this is the broad view picture that I take away from his phenomenalism, is that the world is a set of phenomenal fields. Now, one thing is that these seem to be discrete fields. So if you're in one field, you can add another one, you can take it away, and they're sort of discrete. They're separate things. A conscious entity is sort of identified with one of these phenomenal streams, and he calls them faces. The ego, the self, is present within a stream, but it's not the stream itself. I don't find any objection to that. I do think that selves are something that's not a fundamental part of the world. I think it's something that emerges from the world itself. Qualitative presencing is equal to being. I also share this strong intuition. I can't claim to prove it, but I just have a very strong intuition that in some way that it sort of has to be that way. The entities of the world have all of their being within the phenomenal streams. This is where I think start to get into more potentially objectionable territory that we'll cover in a later video, what some of my specific gripes are. And then finally, that not all things are or have faces, and that those that aren't are splintered among those with the faces. So you could take a view, without having this last item listed, you could say, come away with the idea that, oh, even inanimate objects have their own quote-unquote faces, and so you end up with a sort of more, what a lot of people might consider more like a panpsychist type of view. So in the second part, I'm going to go into what he lists as some of his as his motivations and where I agree with them, maybe where I see some potential issues. He says, one of the weirdest beliefs I argue for, and yet also the essence, is that all being is qualitative. The world is a system of faces, and that there is nothing behind these faces. So, in my view, I completely agree. I share the strong intuition that all being is qualitative, absolutely, in the first sentence. And I think that the second sentence is just a step that I think that I haven't yet seen how that leap is made to then saying that therefore all things are these faces, and I think that there are alternatives to that. So the second motivation he has is, if the world, this is actually a quote from previously that I'm going to reread, because the second quote bears directly on it. If the world is identified with the qualitative presencing of its potential infinity of faces, then entities in the world have all their being in such faces. He says, for me, the ideal sum of faces is an expression of my understanding of quality as necessarily present. It's not that I can prove the non-existence of redness from no perspective. It's more like I'm a logical positivist who thinks the phrase is empty, like a round square. The phrase is indeed an intentional object, just like round square, but it fails to compute or resolve into definite sense. And so I understand his intuition here, but I don't know. I think that there are ways that you can imagine that this necessity would not hold up. So what he's saying is that sort of any sort of qualitative thing, the only way that he can picture it, it's sort of like by definition from a perspective. But if you take sort of the picture that I was talking about a few minutes ago, where I was discussing sort of the world being this sort of unified field of, qualities sort of interacting with each other in various interesting ways, I think the part that that's missing is that as soon as you say that it needs to be from a perspective, I think the word perspective brings a lot of baggage along with it. If you think about just the laws of perspective, the laws of perspective say, okay, if you're looking out and perceiving some certain thing from a particular point of view, this is how the this is how the geometry of that will change based off of your position in relation to the object. And so I think that in order to have something that's structured in terms of the quality, you need to have sort of at least sort of elementary sensory type systems. Like you can imagine some kind of a system that sort of maybe this is sensible or maybe not. I don't think there's any way to just reason our way to say that it's impossible. Would be just some sort of thing that all it can do is experience red or just be completely off or maybe just red or black or something like that. Well, it would be hard to say that that thing had a perspective. Or if it did, I mean, you're sort of you're stretching the word perspective. So I think what I would say that the in order to be read, maybe a sort. You absolutely need a sort of existence in order for any sort of qualitative property. But I think that the perspective thing is it at least is a term that brings along a lot of potential baggage that I don't think is necessary. So I worry about that a little bit because I think that those types of things can snowball into the final conclusion where we disagree, where he and I agree with on a lot along the way, but we disagree on the final conclusion. So I just wanted to note that. Now he says, first, the world is not within conscious beings. Subjects are turned inside out like old socks. Subjects are empty. The subject is better thought of as in the manifested worldly entity. And you see his very sort of creative and lively and vibrant sort of imagery that he uses that I think is just really fantastic. And I agree with this sentiment. I don't think that there's any sort of sense that I think that if there's any sense that we as conscious beings exist, our experience is certainly part of the world, and I think it's part of the world. I have strong intuitions that our experience is part of the world in the same way as any chair or table or electron in some fundamental way. I think that there are different ways of parsing out or cashing out the same underlying reality. And so I think absolutely I agree with the sentiment that the subject should be thought of as manifested in the world. Now he says, what I challenge is the implicit notion of some kind of pseudo-presence from no perspective. My claim is that skeptical physicalists are accidentally projecting a version of Berkeley's God as an omniscient third-person narrator. And maybe I'll just clarify here real quick for those who aren't acquainted. Berkeley was an empiricist and he was an idealist. And his idea as an idealist was that the world doesn't exist until you look at it, until you're perceiving it. And so the classic example, the moon wouldn't be there until you looked at it. Or until some mind was looking at it. And then he got around the problem of there being sort of objects that seem to be out there in between us that we agree on various aspects of. He got around that by invoking a God who sees all things. And so basically any potential issues are just sort of with a literal deus ex machina taken away by this omniscient God. And so that's what he's referring to here. He's saying that physicalists are accidentally appealing to the same sort of omniscient third-person narrator by virtue of their sort of, what they would think of as objective theories of an existing reality out there, which anti-cubism rejects. Now, I think that there is a potential issue here, and that I think that there's a confusion between ontology and epistemology. So ontology has to do with the things that are, and epistemology has to do with the things that you know. And So when he says that skeptical physicalists are projecting a version of Berkeley's God is posited as an ontological thing, where a physicalist theory of things existing out there is first an epistemological thing. Um, so I think that there's a bit of a false equivalence here going on. I don't think that I mean I don't think that there's any necessity to appeal to an actually existing transcendent mind in order to try to give a sort of transcendent account of the things that exist, if that makes sense. So we'll continue here. He says, I know the fire hydrant transcends me. I know that others can see it when I am long gone. So even when he no longer exists, the fire hydrant will still be there. I can even extend my concept of qualitative presence vaguely and imagine how alien archaeologists might have it when our species is gone. So it's an interesting thing because he's sort of towing the line between, on the one hand, he says that the only existence of the fire hydrant is within the minds that perceive it, and yet he still acknowledges that the fire hydrant transcends himself. And I mean, I don't think that there's a logical contradiction there. But what I think you'll see in what I think I'm going to do in my next video is talk about some of my objections more thoroughly. And it's just that I don't think you just have to take that as a brute fact. And I think that you're doing so unnecessarily. And it's not just this as a brute fact, but all things that are not observed or potentially unobserved, or both in the present and for eons in the past and past and into the future. You just sort of have to take these regularities as brute facts. And there's nothing wrong with brute facts. Every worldview has to accept brute facts. But when there is a simple addition to your ontology, which is to say, well, maybe the object actually exists in some sense independently of any phenomenal stream, which seems to me like a pretty natural concession to make. And then now all of a sudden, all these things that were brute facts are features that you would expect in the system. And so I think that really gets to what the fundamental problem that I see with the view is. Let's see here. So what he says now is, what I challenge is the implicit notion of some kind of pseudo-presence from no perspective. My claim is that... Oh, I'm sorry. I just read that. The difficulty is that perception is a presencing of the world itself. To me, it seems that you take it as the meaningful being of these patterns of activity for granted. This is, by the way, in response to... I mentioned that I see perception as being a sort of pattern of activity in the world, no different than, I think that all things that manifest in the world are different patterns of activity in the world in a very general sense. And what I was referring to, and I think he took in a different way, he thought I was actually talking about neurons. But what I actually had in mind when I was talking about activity, patterns of activity in the world, was the perception itself. I mean, obviously, when I perceive something, it's lively. The patterns dance before me and they change from moment to moment. They're structured. And that's what I had in mind in terms of patterns of activity. I was talking about the perception itself. Although I wouldn't deny patterns of activity that you might prescribe to the neurons as perceived from the outside. It would be different from the pattern that you might see if you sort of were a set of neurons, which is in the human case something like human perception. But I actually had in mind the perception when I was talking about this. So he says, as if they weren't precisely what we perceive in the world. And so I agree with this. So what we absolutely do perceive, our perception, I think I have a strong intuition that agrees with him. Our perceptions and all of our experience is part of the world. The experience itself is part of the world, not just the neurons, but the experience itself. And we need to understand how those things fit together, not as these separate, completely separate things. There is some relationship that needs to be drawn within a context they're where they're not seen as entirely separate things. They're different. I would say it's most attractive to see them as different manifestations of the same underlying reality. So he says, to me, and I could be wrong, it seems that you are maybe missing the hard problem of the physical. And to me, if I understand what he means by the hard problem of the physical, what my intuition of what that means is something I completely agree with, which is that it's sometimes taken for granted, the hard problem, that, okay, we have this physical stuff. How do we get consciousness out of it? But it's sort of taken for granted that we know what the physical stuff is. But I would say that on a fundamental ontological level, we might be less certain of what the underlying physical stuff is. If they were, let's say we took a sort of dualist perspective and we said that there's like mental stuff and physical stuff. I mean, I at least understand the nature of the being of the mental stuff, and that's what I am. I know that immediately. The physical stuff we seem to only know from the outside. Now, I would say that these are two different views of the same stuff. I don't think that you can throw out either one. They're just alternative views that give you different information about the system, but they're two different views of the same thing. So he continues talking about the hard problem with the physical. So I agree that there is a hard problem with the physical. I think we just approach the problem differently. He says, the objects are out there independent of qualitative presencing. And I sort of have a view where the out there is a sense of out there that I think you can make sense of. Now bear in mind, I don't think that there's sort of like discrete walls around every conscious entity that you can just draw easily and separate the subject from what's not in the subject. And I think actually you can actually find this in your own experience just by things that are sort of on the edge of your perception. The feeling of the chair against your legs. Like a minute ago, a few seconds ago, you weren't aware of it. Now you were aware of it. Was it part of your experience before I mentioned that and your attention was drawn to it or not? It's like, well, maybe sort of in a weird way. Sometimes you might have somebody will be talking to you, you'll be thinking about something else, and then they ask you a question and you can sort of replay it in your head and then you hear it a second later. Was that part of your experience? It's a very gray thing. I don't think that something being part of our experience or not is an easy binary sort of yes or no sort of thing. And so just putting it out there that there's no hard lines here, I still think it sort of makes sense to think of out there objects that are independent of our own conscious existence. This is an important distinction. Independent of our own conscious of our own conscious or phenomenological stream. And the reason I say that is because in order for something to be conscious or phenomenological, I think is more than just to be qualitative. I think it's to have a persistence over time. It's to have a coherence in structure, not only over time, but within any given moment. There's structure to my experience. There's things that I know about the future and about the past and are available to me now. And if you can imagine a sort of system like I was talking about earlier, some sort of like radio static of sensations. I wouldn't call that conscious. That's something else. And so I think that it makes perfect sense to say that there are qualitative things that are sort of quote unquote out there in relation to a subject, but that are not part of any phenomenological field. So I think that's one of the core bases of where I think we part ways. And then finally he says, I consider that this is an unwarranted extension of misreading or misreading, I think he meant to write, extension or misreading of the indeed individual perceiver transcendence of the object into an absolute transcendence. Now, I don't know exactly, this is something I'm not really clear on. I hope to get some clarification on what the difference between an absolute transcendence and an individual perceiver transcendence. Because it seems to me that if you're granting something transcendence, I'm a little confused there. One other thing that I'll throw in here is that it's not entirely clear to me why you would treat the independent existence of other phenomenological streams in a different way than you might inanimate entities. I mean, if you're going to say everything is just part of the phenomenological stream, then why don't you just go full solipsist and just deny that if you're gonna deny independent existence to the other entities of your experience, why do you grant them specially to the things that you perceive as conscious? I don't really understand why one thing falls into one category and the other is something that can only be manifested another way. I think this might be the last slide here. He says, to be sure, we can erect causal models that involve neurons, etc., but even there, neurons have their being, all of it, in various fields. For the most part, they are signitively present. We imagine them, we model them with math, etc. And I think on some level, I mean, there's a couple different things going on here. The first thing is that our notion of objects like neurons and chairs and things like that, I mean, anybody can say, oh, well, there's no such thing as chairs. There's only atoms, and below the atoms, there's only this, and below that, there's only this. I don't think that's like a very interesting thing to say. Oh, there's no chairs. I mean, it's on some level there absolutely are chairs. I'm sitting on one right now. It has causal efficacy in the world and in my experience, and so in some way it exists. I mean, we can talk about, if we want to talk about different types of existence or something like that, but to say that it doesn't exist is just, to me, I don't know. It's a semantics thing, but it's not a useful way to play around with semantics. So to say that they're only signitively present or we imagine them, I mean, I don't know if I go that far. I mean, I think you would have to have like a sort of like very crude reductionist view of the world to and maybe there's more subtle ways of cashing this out. I'm not sure, but just intuitively, I would need some convincing of that. I think as soon as you can assign causal models of things, I think you can talk about their existence in a way that's perfectly coherent. And I don't even think that on a fundamental level it makes a difference to like if we're talking about ontology, things that exist. I even on that level, I don't know if it makes a difference to that. I think if your ontology denies the existence of something that seems apparent to exist, then you owe us a pretty strong account of how that's the case. Okay, so going on. So neurons and dogs and prime numbers have their being in these faces or streams. I oppose the postulation of the quote-unquote real thing beyond or outside of these streaming faces as basically meaningless. And so here's another thing, and then finally he says, as a harmless misreading of the logical transcendence of the object. So this really is the crux of the disagreement. I oppose the postulation of the real thing beyond or outside the streaming of these faces as basically meaningless. Well, I don't think it's meaningless at all. I mean, if there are things out there that have causal efficacy and you claim that they're not real, I think you owe us an explanation of exactly in what way you mean that they're not real. And on the other hand, by taking them as real, I mean the world I experience is as real to me as anything could be, and so I think in some sense, real is an honorific term. This is not an original thought of mine, but it's not really clear in all instances what distinction you're making by calling something real. So I don't know. I generally, when people start arguing about what's real and not, I tend to tune out because it's usually a question of semantics, and I agree with him that, and there are, it makes a lot of sense to make distinctions of um, of these sorts in ontology, but I just don't quite follow there.